Shh. This podcast is aimed to help you navigate your relationships, maximize your pleasure, and get the most out of your sex life. Each week, we cover different topics related to the full spectrum of sexuality and romance. So, who am I? My name is Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. People often ask me why I chose to get into sex ed, and it's because talking about sexuality is my favorite topic. I love to read about it, talk about it, teach it. It is the best. And I have a firm belief that people need to be able to connect with their sexuality. And I love helping people connect with it and understand it and foster healthier relationships. So if you're struggling with an area around sexuality and relationships and have a question that you'd like answered, please send in your questions to questions@exploresextalk.com. So what are we talking about today? Today, I want to talk about good versus bad relationships and how we can spot the signs in our relationships. How do we tell if a partner is a keeper or someone we should let go? How do we tell early on if this relationship is going to be good? Have you ever seen a couple who is clearly miserable or a friend who's just in a terrible relationship and wondered how could they ever have gotten there? It's even harder for us when it's somebody we've known for a long time and we want them to be happy, and yet we just can't understand why they choose to stay with someone who clearly makes them unhappy and, just isn't a good relationship. Sadly, there's a lot of horror stories out there for bad relationships. They range from dysfunctional to miserable to even highly abusive. But relationships rarely start out this way, and many people who've left abusive relationships often wonder how they ended up there. Because at the start of the relationship, they never would have tolerated the type of behavior that, ended up evolving. So how did they get there? How does someone end up in a relationship like that? The secret is that these things tend to happen slowly and usually over a long period of time. The negative patterns are things that just kind of slowly evolve. It starts with simple things that don't really seem like a big deal at the time, and it becomes a slippery slope where, as people agree to more smaller requests, it kind of builds to the point where it feels silly to refuse a request that is maybe only a little bit bigger than the last one you said yes to. It's like taking extremely small baby steps down a ledge that's only growing narrower. When you first start out, it seems perfectly safe because the path is nice and wide and comfortable, but as you go along, it's slowly and almost imperceptibly getting narrower. And at a certain point, you probably do notice that it's a lot more narrow than it was, but by that point, you've already come so far, and it can't get much narrower, right? It may be easy to feel like you've come so far, it's too late to turn back now, we just have to see it through. Now, if that sounds silly or feels silly, it's actually not. A number of psychological mechanisms that help us make quick decisions and help us adapt and survive life can actually lead us astray. I'm only going to cover really one main one today, but if you're interested in learning more about this, I actually highly recommend reading Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert, I think it's Cialdini. It goes over a number of different psychological mechanisms that people have that influence in all kinds of different ways and actually how it can lead us to change our behavior. So the one that I kind of really want to touch on, one of these key mechanisms that so often plays huge roles in relationships, is our need to be committed and consistent to our idea of ourselves and who we are. This is, one of the reasons why that series of requests that start small and continue to increase, like a slippery slope, can be such a trap for us. When we comply with that first small request, it seems like nothing, but we're actually setting a precedent, and whether or not we realize it, we're allowing that to adjust who we think we are. So, for example, let's look at a couple who may have evolved an abusive relationship where, say, partner A has total control over the money and partner B does all the chores, stays at home, is not allowed to have a job or socialize with anyone, without the express consent of partner A, can't spend any money without the express consent of partner A. Now, A situation like this may have started from a really simple request, like partner A asking them, partner B, to take over the chore of cooking dinner because it's not something they enjoy. Partner A may even flatter partner B's cooking. Now, this may seem like a super simple request, and partner B now feels flattered that their partner is making such a big deal and loves their cooking so much, so maybe they agree. They take pride in putting a good and delicious meal on the table, especially since partner A feels cooking is so challenging. Now, this isn't an abnormal request at all. I'm sure many couples make these kinds of agreements over chores. There's that division of chores when you live together, and not everything has to go super far. But what can happen, now is that partner B is now taking pride in doing that chore and caring for their partner in that way, and they've changed this internal script of who they are. It's not a conscious choice. It's just something that happens, like, oh, well, it's part of my self-identity now that I'm a good cook and that I care for my partner, and part of caring for my partner is cooking for them because they don't enjoy cooking. Now, partner A may request they take over another household chore after some time passes, maybe an extra cleaning chore. They can once again compliment the skills of partner B, really hammer home how it makes them feel cared for and special. And once again, it seems like a small request, and it's consistent with this new self-image of partner B, how they are someone who cares for their partner and does that extra little bit. So it's easy to comply with this new request, particularly if it seems small. And these small requests can continue to climb until partner B has taken over all of the household responsibilities. And maybe then at that point, partner A suggests that, hey, why doesn't partner B stay at home and quit their job because the couple has enough money? And it's the least partner A could do to give partner B a bit more time to themselves for all their hard work and pride that they take in taking care of all the domestic stuff and putting food on the table and so on and so forth. And if they go through that, it may seem like great at the time. And once they're home, once partner B is staying at home, from there, it's only another series of small steps to partner A controlling all the money, since partner is the only one working, right? If you toss in a little entitlement, it's not a huge leap for partner A to start taking for granted all the domestic labor partner B is doing. I mean, let's face it, society still doesn't place a high value on domestic labor, right? So it would be easy for partner A to start taking that for granted. And, partner A could develop this self-image that they are the financial provider. And they could evolve this image to feel that this labor is entitled to them because they are bringing the money in. Meanwhile, partner B has continued to develop this strong sense of identity as a caring and responsible person. When we accelerate these attitudes and combine them with small steps, continue to amplify these opposing self-images, it's no longer hard to see how this can develop into a highly abusive and toxic relationship. It should be no surprise that self-image is incredibly important to us. How we feel about ourselves impacts obviously it's directly tied to self-esteem, but it impacts how we interact with other people, how we carry ourselves, how much effort we put into tasks. So people tend to feel psychologically uncomfortable when we act in ways that are not consistent with our self-image. When we do act in ways that conflict with that, we tend to justify those choices to ourselves, and it sort of subconsciously realigns our self-image so that it's consistent. So our need to be consistent to ourselves and be consistent in the eyes of others is actually a very strong motivator for our behavior. You can see this in marketing and sales techniques. They're all built on this principle because it's super effective in influencing our choices and our behavior. Now, not every small choice leads into a terrible direction in a relationship. In many cases, the same psychological mechanism can lead people to develop really wonderful, supportive, loving relationships. And it all depends on the patterns that people develop in their relationship. Some people will say and believe that relationships end up bad simply because one of the people in them is a terrible person. Now, sometimes this is the case. There are some terrible people out there. But it's also true that sometimes people just develop bad patterns of behavior. They can be perfectly good people, but they end up responding to a particular situation or a particular person in a way to try and help them cope with any negative feelings they have. And this is why some relationships or some people can just bring out the worst in us, while other relationships or other people can bring out the best and really help us shine. So, how do we separate the good things from the potentially bad? What small steps should we be watching? Because it's clearly that we're not going to think about every single small request or small step, so to speak, to an extreme conclusion to see if it's going to be a problem, right? So what should we be watching or to consider carefully? Or, what should we be watching to make sure that we are nurturing some sort of healthier relationship? Now, most of you probably heard the expression red flag, that something can be a huge red flag, a warning that we should have seen. We can keep our eyes out for patterns of red flags because often it's not just one specific thing. It's a combination of small things, like small indicators that this person may not be a good fit for us, or that it may end up that the relationship is going down an unhealthy path. So what kinds of things should we look for? Now, if you're early in a relationship, this tends to be a little bit easier, mostly because later in relationships, we tend to justify things to ourselves, right? So mostly going to be focusing on things that you can look at early. I mean, these are also things that you can look at if you're already in relationship and sort of questioning whether or not it's good. But some red flags can include things like your partner is trying to separate you from your family or friends. If it's early in the relationship, do they avoid talking about personal details? Do they get mad at you when you ask about them? Or maybe they're constantly diverting the conversation away from answering those questions. Another one is maybe they tell you inconsistent details about themselves. They're constantly changing their story about who they are and where they're from and so on and so forth. Constantly breaking their promises is another big one. Always finding excuses for doing things that are important to you. You always do stuff that's important to them, but when it comes to doing stuff that's important to you, there's always a reason why you're not doing it. Another one is blaming others for when things go wrong. They're not taking any personal responsibility, or maybe they make other people entirely responsible for all of their happiness. Another thing is pushing the relationship too fast. So things like, swearing undying love too early in the relationship, or maybe if this is somebody you're communicating with online, you haven't met in person yet, swearing undying love before meeting in person, basically trying to push the relationship too fast. Do they lose control of their emotions really easily in arguments? Do they immediately go to name calling or blaming? Do they push you down or make you feel less? I mean, this is important whether it's private or in front of other people, but if they're also doing it in front of other people, that is a huge red flag. Do they turn on their friends really quickly? Does a friend of theirs go from like the best friend they've ever had to the worst enemy at the drop of a hat? Do they treat you really well one day, but then super harshly the next and for no real reason at all? Do they try to keep you in the dark about what's going to happen next in the relationship? Or if they don't respect your feelings or your rights or your opinions, maybe they belittle your ideas or your hurt feelings. Another one that sort of ties into an episode we did very, very early on is lavishing you with expensive gifts in exchange for your compliance and other matters. And that sort of goes back to that emotional blackmail piece. I did an episode on avoiding emotional blackmail. I think it's episode 4 or 5. So if you are interested in learning more about that, it's a good episode. Check it out. Somebody who's constantly questioning your loyalty. They don't trust you. They are not willing to trust you. That can be quite tough. Oh, and one other one that I want to mention is when people have nothing good to say about past partners. This is one that's often overlooked because society has tended to really normalize that idea of, the quote unquote crazy ex. But the reality is how we speak about our past partners is actually something that's pretty telling about us, because it shows how we react to things when things have not gone our way, or with people who may have wronged us, or people who we don't think we're going to get anything else from. So how we talk about them can be fairly telling of our respect for other people, particularly when they're not in our good graces. So I know that's a big list that I kind of burned through really quickly, but what kinds of things should we look for positive signs or green flags, if you will? And there's definitely things that we want to nurture to build healthier relationships. Now, the funny thing about these things is that, once again, they seem really simple and straightforward. The funny thing about the green flags is that even though they're simple and should be givens, it's not something that all of us do. I mean, the first big one, is communication. I know I talk about this all the time, but seriously, communicating, being open to talk, open to learn, open to getting better at developing this skill. So many people are not good communicators and they don't learn how, and that's a problem. And the thing is, somebody does not need to be the best communicator, but they have to try. And hopefully, they should be open to learning and improving their communication skills. This means more than also just how they talk to us, but also how they listen. Now, we touched on some of this 2 weeks ago in the episode talking about good sex, so I'm not going to rehash it here, but if you missed it, please go back and check out that episode. There's a lot of good tips in there about communication. So another huge green flag is respect. And all good relationships have this foundation. Partners should respect each other, and that's going to come out in a number of ways, from respecting boundaries to respecting thoughts and feelings. And if both people are respecting and setting healthy boundaries, it's actually going to build like a super solid foundation for a relationship to last, and potentially to last a really long time. Because when we're in a mutually respectful relationship, it actually provides extremely fertile ground for love and caring to grow. So kind of the secret to long-term relationships is that healthy sense of respect. Another key thing to watch out for is how your partner supports you. Do they care about your feelings when you're upset? How they respond to you in those moments? Not everyone is good in a time of crisis or upset, but even if they're not good at it, do they try? Do they show care about your well-being? And support, when we're talking about support, it's not just about for when you're down either. How partners support each other in day-to-day life and pursuing dreams makes a difference. Does your partner build you up? Do they encourage you to pursue your dreams and be the best person you can be? Most importantly, do they celebrate success with you? I know that seems simple, like, oh, we're happy. People should be happy with us, particularly our partners, but so many people can feel jealous or, I hate to say it, but petty. And not everyone can celebrate success with you. So having somebody who can is a big deal, and be genuinely happy for you, right? So often it's these little things that make or break a relationship, and not because they are little, but because they are the day-to-day things that make up a whole and can change the direction of the overall relationship. And it's often without us noticing. So the difference between whether or not your partner is a keeper depends on looking at these little things and how you and your partner respond to them. If you notice something that's a bit of a red flag, how does your partner respond to that when it's addressed? How do you respond? These responses can be super telling and can also end up changing things. I like to be an optimist. We always have the opportunity to try and make things better and grow in new and positive ways. But if in that moment, if we or maybe our partner is not willing to take those positive steps, we need to think about making a decision as to how much time we're going to give it for change. Because if we don't, we may end up justifying that to ourselves. We may end up justifying bad behavior and letting it thrive and letting it take steps in the wrong direction, right? Because we believe that things will get better. We can't just believe it. We have to believe it, but we also have to make it happen. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for everyone who tuned in for this episode. Please join us again next week. In the meantime, feel free to check out all the articles and games and fun stuff on my website, exploresextalk.com. There's tons of stuff on there, so check it out. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, hit that subscribe button, share it, like it, recommend it to a friend, and I will see you all next week. In the meantime, stay safe,